Hello everybody, welcome to my talk, Cyber Threat Intelligence for the Rest of Us, Implementing Intelligence-Driven Threat Hunting in Offensive Security Program without dedicated teams. I am Tom Somerville. I am a security researcher at Grimm, and I have come from many years as a traditional blue team IT security background. Not much in the way of social media activity, so if you want to get in touch with me, please reach out to me after the talk to get you my contact info. So what are we going to be talking about here? While I was at my previous employer, we were in a position where we were wrapping up the finishing details on a multi-year complete overhaul of our infosec program. Talking like splitting up into multiple teams, complete pull and replace of our SIM and log collection infrastructure, reassessing our tooling, additional staffing, and more. And so while we were sitting pretty, we had two big questions. First, how well did we do? And second, how do we mature the program from here? And so I got to have a lot of fun being that person that got to piece all these different questions into this program that is what we'll be talking about today. So this is more or less what we came up with. For us, our entry point was our engineered network. Remember, we just spent years overhauling and reorganizing almost everything infosec, and all that work influences our time spent on cyber threat intelligence. By narrowing our focus when researching threat actors and their techniques and procedures that we believe our implementation should already prevent or catch. Then we move on to cyber threat intelligence, where we spend our time researching threat actors that would target us, learning their techniques and procedures, and identifying items for hunting in emulation. From there, we go to offsec, where we actually spend some time recreating the activity that we just researched in a lab environment, and then once it's finished being labbed out, we execute it in production. And this will put our previous engineering work to the test. After that, we move over to threat hunting, where we spend time looking for the various TTPs that were carved out during our intel research and the activity that we performed during emulation. There is an optional exit here for incident response in the rare event that it may be needed. So then once both offsec and hunting has been completed, we move over to the assessment. We just spent a lot of time playing around. And so here is where we assess everything we've just done, consolidate into actionable items, and essentially create JIRAs and write fancy reports to management and engineers. From there, those tickets that we've opened will further drive our engineering environment in the weeks, in the months, and the years to come. And additionally, everything gets reported to management, who can use this data as a way to report on the effectiveness of the program to their own bosses and peers, but also use it to plan future projects, expenditures, justify additional staffing, and etc. Management can also have an input into this whole life cycle. For example, maybe they want to measure our capacity to detect and respond to that big thing, the news that happened last week. And then the whole thing gets put on loop, essentially. The best part of it is that this train doesn't have a fixed speed. And how long and how often you repeat this cycle is up to you and your available time and resources. I would usually fit this whole life cycle into a single week. That would be one individual for 1 week would do everything I just mentioned, minus the resolution of any engineering project work. And we would usually repeat this once every 6 weeks. So what does it actually look like to perform this activity? Well, we start with cyber threat intelligence. This is what ensures we optimize our time to come and do not spend time hunting or emulating items not relevant to us or our environment. Our threat intel is obtained from a few different sources. We use some paid for as well as some free. However, for this presentation, I'm going to be using all open threat intel. My favorite free source of intelligence is by far MITRE, and their groups page is my personal favorite little corner of the site. I'll say that for a very long time, open threat intelligence was enough, and I barely touched threat intel even though we had it for other reasons. So if you plan to implement something similar to this, you don't need paid intel for a good while. However, there is value there for paid intelligence, mainly frequency and relevancy. A lot of time, open intel is dated and things no longer work as described in the report, which may be in part as to why that intelligence has become open in the first place. So paid intelligence gets you what happened today, yesterday, or maybe last week, rather than what happened months ago or maybe even like a year or so ago. So the first thing we did is we compiled a list of threat actors relevant to us. Initially, the compilation of this list took a little time. However, once compiled, I only occasionally had to update it. Note, this list does not have to be perfect to derive value. There will likely be many threat actors applicable to you, and if you miss one or two, you'll still be plenty effective, so don't sweat this too much. So how do I identify relevant groups to us? Well, using MITRE groups, we simply read the descriptions column. Let's say you are a large manufacturing company based in the US. You'd probably be interested in knowing what Foxkitten is doing up there at the top. Probably less interested in Dark Hydrus in the middle, but what about a group like Wizard Spider? I'll give you a hint. Most of us should probably care about what groups that are classified as financially motivated or e-crime are up to. So I definitely recommend following and hunting those groups as well. Now that I know who would target me, I would change my focus as to how they're targeting me. Mondays, I'd start out with a generic who's been active recently and take a quick look to see if any new TAs have moved into the space that we care about. We generally would choose a threat actor for the week that has been active and who hasn't gotten a lot of attention from us in a while. For the stock, we'll take Fin 7 for a spin. When we go to the actor page, we see the last modified date, useful for knowing about how active this TA is. But note that this is not a when the TA was last active date, but when MITRE has last updated this group's page. The intel they have updated the page with may or may not be very recent. The meat of the group's page is going to be this techniques used, and it's mapped back to attack, obviously. This is useful for us in our overall tracking of TPPs that have been validated in our environment. And then note that all of these TTPs have references to the right of each technique. Those little numbers link to publicly available source documentation that has more details. Scrolling down a little further, we have a list of the software that the TA has been known to use, links to more references. So going through the references here, I'm going to go and grab one of the most recent ones. Eventually, I may work through all of these for every TA. I probably won't. Things date pretty quickly, and I'll probably move on to paid intelligence before then, but I guess you could if you really wanted to. So let's click on one, and it takes us to a report by Spider Labs. We already have an actor to emulate and hunt this week, Fin 7 in our case. All their tactics and techniques are neatly laid out for us, and this report should get us some of their procedures for the techniques that they use. And just in this first paragraph, we have some interesting data. Their payload is Pilament. It's installed through application shimming. It tells us what shimming is in a reference for more detail. It tells us why they shim, which is for persistence, exactly what the installation of this shim looks like. We can go further, and we can see that they use a utility that is a native Microsoft binary. It's instantiated from a PowerShell script. It tells us where the shim database is copied to after the install, so we can go look for that while hunting. It tells us which registry keys were modified, more things to hunt for. These things are usually very densely packed with information, and I could probably just sit up here and translate this report for a whole 30 minutes, so I'm going to abbreviate the parsing and stop here. With time, you'll learn what makes sense to hunt on in your own environment and how to recognize and pull valuable actionable data out of these. And this is just all the actionable intel that I pulled out of this report that I could fit on this screen. Just as an example of how densely packed these are. So at the end of Monday, we would have identified a threat actor potentially interested in my environment that I would be focusing on for a week, a number of TPPs that the actor is known for using, a list of procedures to hunt for later, and at least one procedure that we will emulate. What we just covered usually won't take a full day, so you should have ample time to run over many detailed intel reports on your TA of choice and pick many good targets for hunting and emulation later on in the week. maybe start on the next portion in the late afternoon. So once CTI portion of our week is over, we move on to emulation, or just general offensive security work. Don't worry too much about the code that you're going to see in the screen. It can be a bit hard to read, especially with my picture there in the corner. However, these slides, all of the text, as well as copies of all of the code, will be available on my GitHub, which there will be a link at the end of the presentation if you want this for later. So we move on to threat actor emulation, or as closely as we can, we're going to emulate a portion of the attack chain in our own environment. I would generally spend 2 to 3 days on this section. From our example report, SpiderLab tells us that Fin7 uses a PowerShell script to install a shim database that patches the payment processing service. The shim code executes a malicious payload that's stored in the registry. The malicious payload is Pilament. So that's what we're going to try to do here. Sort of. Obviously, I'm not going to install Pilament, so we're going to change up the malicious payload to our own. And I do not have the exact same target application that was shimmed, so we're going to provide our own application to shim as well. Okay, so to start, I don't have that payment processing application that was mentioned in the report, so I'm going to just whip up a fake one to target. Here's the source code of what I wrote and what it looks like when I run. Next, we need a malicious payload. I don't want to use Pilament, so in true POC fashion, just a small program that launches calc.exe when executed. Next, the report says the final payload is stored in the registry key. So I need to serialize our payload and store it as a string in the registry. Here I've converted the binary into a byte array, compressed in base 64 encoded that. And this is how we will load that string into the relevant registry key mentioned in the report. Next, we have to have some way to pull that string out, decode, decompress, and load into memory and execute. So here we create some code, compile this up, test it out. Once again, this code is kind of small, so it will be available on GitHub after the talk if you want to take a look at it. So when we run this application, we can see over on the right hand side when I hit run on that load reg key binary, calc opens, which means it was able to pull that string out of registry, decode, decompress, and execute just fine. Now we'll work on creating a DLL that will be shimmed into our payment processing application. This DLL will execute the binary that decodes, decompresses, and executes that registry key. The DLL had to be written in C++ because apparently DLLs created in C# are incapable of having default entry points. So just saved you a couple hours of troubleshooting there. So the report stated that the shim code directly loads the binary stored in the registry key from the DLL. And a key I will notice that we have that one extra step in there where the shim code is running a binary that pulls the string and executes that payload from registry. So why do we do this? Well, 2 reasons. First, my C++ is not where my Python or C# is, and because at work I'd only get 2, maybe 3 days to lab out and execute this emulation. In the instance of this talk, a little less time than that. And so these are some compromises that we have to live with. I was originally super upset about having to make this compromise during the presentation because it doesn't perfectly emulate RTA's procedure. However, I'm okay with it now because I think it's an important lesson to learn with threat emulation. There will be times that you cannot perfectly emulate every little detail of the entire attack chain, and you'll be forced to come up with a good alternative that still works but doesn't deviate too far, especially when we're trying to emulate C2 infrastructure. So once we have our DLL compiled, we can give it a quick test using run DLL, and voila, calc opens. And so now on to create a shim database. The shim database patches an application by modifying or injecting into memory at runtime. In our case, we'll be injecting a DLL at runtime. First, to create the shim, we'll have to install the Windows Assessment Development Kit on our development box. We've got a little video here we'll walk through. First, we'll open up the application that we just installed and create a new application fix. We're going to give it a name, and we're going to select the program that we wish to shim. In our case, it's going to be the payment processing app that we wish to shim. We'll skip that page. We'll scroll down here, and we'll find and select inject DLL, and that's going to be the compatibility fix we use. Up in parameters, we're going to give it the full path that our DLL to inject will be located. In our case, ctemp. We're going to hit next here. We're going to uncheck all on this page and then select finish. So our shim is saved. Our shim is created. So here we're going to save it. We'll just name it same thing that it was in the Fin7 report. We'll save this over to ctemp. Okay. Next, I'm going to install the shim the same way they did in the report. And we're greeted with installation complete. So now when I execute that payment processing app that we shimmed, you can see that the application runs, but also calc.exe also runs, which would imply that that full chain of execution is working, ultimately executing our binary stored in the registry. Okay, so this is great and all, fully labbed out. However, this is not how Fin7 executed their attack chain. Our report says that they did all this instantiated from a single PowerShell script. So now we've created and tested each individual part. Let's throw it all together and script this out into a more portable script format. All right, so first we had three binaries. We have our shim database, we have our DLL, and we have the binary that extracts and executes the registry string. We can read these binaries, raw bytes, then base64 encode them into an array for later use with the PowerShell code at the top. And then with the PowerShell code at the bottom, we can decode, stream that byte array back into a binary on disk. Our report doesn't say how Fin7 lifted and shipped these binaries to their targets. There's many different ways that you could do this, and so this is just one way that I chose how to do. So once we run through our three binaries and convert those into a string that we can move around in our script, we can then build out the rest of our script, which is what it looks like here. And this will just go through and decode and stream those bytes to disk one at a time, put the registry key value string into the recognized registry key, and then install the shim database once everything is completed. And we copy this whole script over, execute it in PowerShell, and we agree with standard out that the shim database has been successfully installed. If we go back to our payment processing app, you can see that once again, app runs as well as our payload that's stored in registry key. So emulation portion has been fully labbed out. So now we can go and we can take that PowerShell script, run in production in various different environments, and see how our protections and our detections stand up. So Monday left me with a lot of good things to hunt for. Tuesday and Wednesday, probably a good part of Thursday, I actually emulated that activity, or at least part of the activity that I'll be hunting for. And so now it's time for us to go looking for that activity. So why wait to hunt until after we do actor emulation? Well, because now we have a control. And during the actor emulation, we've already tested at least 4 things. We've tested our protection measures, our detection measures, analyst capabilities to properly triage and respond to those detections, and probably tested our SOX playbooks for relevancy. So while we hunt, we're going to think back to the intel that we gathered and our notes that we took on Monday, and what we should be looking for. And for our example, we could look for things like, do we expect the use of shim databases in our environment? And do we see the relevant shim databases in the relevant paths in our environment? Do we see command execution for that Microsoft binary, the sdb inst.exe? Are there relevant registry keys set? And if so, what are they set to? What's the normal value for these keys that we would expect them to be if we see those? Do we or have we ever seen any other relevant files created that were mentioned in the report? And of course, other items that we've noted down on Monday from other reports that I didn't include in this talk's example. So how to query for this activity is going to depend a lot on your environment, your sim, and your logging capabilities. I'm not going to go into any details on how to query your environment or how to threat hunt. Aaron and I already made that talk a couple of years ago, and so here is the link. I know you can't see the far right side of that link, but it will be available on GitHub in the slide deck and in the recordings. So instead of focusing my time on how to threat hunt, I just kind of want to say, like, if you're thinking about implementing a program like this, you probably already know how to query your logs. And so instead, I'm going to focus on what you should be doing while you're looking through your logs for this type of activity that we just emulated, as well as what we read in our reports. First, before you do any of this, you should at least think that you've collected the logs in the environment. We just performed that activity, so we have a control. So go look for the logs of the activity that you generated, not necessarily the stuff that you saw in the report, but verify, okay, yes, the stuff I actually executed in our environment was logged. If I don't see those, I know I have a problem somewhere else. If I do see those, I can be more comforted by the fact that my threat hunting queries turned up nothing. Also, are the devices in the environment, are there any devices in our environment that are missing from logs? It's very possible that I have a couple of POSs that are being logged, and then a couple that are either broken or for some reason logs are not shipping to our central environment. So I need to make sure that I am reproducing this emulation on a large portion or a large sample of our environment, as much as I can get away with, to kind of validate the effectiveness of the equipment that we put in, and to make sure that I can rely on the absence of information that I see. Also, remember, non-malicious activity are still findings. It's very common to spend hours and hours of hunting that result in zero malicious activity identified, but it wasn't a waste of time. In fact, most of the time your hunting activities are going to end up like this, and if they don't, I feel really bad for your IR team. While hunting, also ask yourself, should this type of activity be allowed to execute under any circumstances? So in our example that we covered, should we allow application shimming in the first place or anywhere in our environment? Often, hunts will result in assessments for the architecture teams to review how things have been deployed, or projects that clearly got rolled to production but did not consult sanity during the design phase. And lastly, I think most critically, don't hunt this activity twice. In reality, you probably will come back to a lot of things more than once, or at least very similar activity, as you probably cannot ensure that you can prevent everything from executing in all places forever, 100% certainty. But regardless of the protections in place that I encountered during emulation, do we currently detect for this activity? I'm a strong believer that you should still detect for activity that you have prevention mechanisms in place for. Yes, it stopped that, but I want to know that someone is attempting to do these types of things, and so that I can actually stop them before they're maybe successful. And so also, if it was worth your time to emulate and hunt on, you should probably figure out how you convert that to continuous coverage going forward. If I'm hunting it, I'm writing a detection rule if it doesn't already exist. And while hunting for activity, keep in mind the structure of my logs, the sequence of how that activity happened and occurred in those reports, as well as emulation. What would be the most reliable way that I could perform these detections? Because remember, this is a one-man program, and so you're going to be opening up tickets on how the detections can be created or improved. and it's probably going to be you that has to write those rules. So take your notes here. Okay, so lastly, I just spent a whole lot of time doing research, doing emulation, and hunting. And so what value did I provide during this week as a week of activity? And how do I write all this up into the reports that management loves? So the value that we've done is we've updated a list of threat actors that would hypothetically be interested in us. We learned more about what their recent activity has been, which of them are active and which of them are dormant. We learned what their latest motives and their latest TTPs are, and if they've remained the same or if those have changed. We've increased our knowledge of where our attack surface intersects the threat actor's capabilities. We've tested at least some real-world procedures in our own environment. We were able to see how our protection capability against said procedures stands up. We were able to see how well our detection capability for said procedures is. We were able to test our log collection capability and validate that it is working as expected. And we were able to test our analyst response capability and maybe identify gaps for future training. And it also means that we're inherently able to test and validate our existing playbooks and see if they stood up to the challenge of emulation. We were able to look for additional TPPs other than what we emulated. Almost certainly gained some new insight into our own environment that we didn't already know, probably uncovered shadow IT, poor engineering, opened up a few JIRAs for GRC or architecture to go over. We probably opened a number of JIRAs for our own team or my future self to go over. Probably identified gaps in visibility or protection mechanisms that we either thought were in place or didn't know were gaps, and that can be fixed or resolved with future project time or purchases as necessary. We were able to provide management with validation of our various tools, procedure implementations, and time spent in the past to ensure that all of that was not for waste. Also, we've given them data that they can use to plan for future project time and expenditures and staffing, etc. And then maybe most importantly, we were able to mix up the daily routine a little bit and sharpen our own knowledge and skills. And for me, that sounds like a lot of value for 5 business days. Okay, so I'm going to be available in Discord for any questions that anyone may have. So see you there.